Hello, and thanks for watching this special edition of the News at 6. We've been taking your questions on WISTV.com throughout the afternoon on this stimulus standoff. Right now, we have Governor Sanford live in our studio with our Judy Gatson. Let's go to Judy and the governor.
All right, thanks a lot, Ben. And Governor Sanford, we want to thank you for taking the time to join us here on WIS News 10. Right. I want to cover as much ground as possible, starting with an article in today's Wall Street Journal. They used a quote in an analogy that you've talked about before, which says, say you win the lottery, a prudent household would not only spend some of the money, they pay down the mortgage. And most people agree that makes perfect sense under normal circumstances. But if you have a leak in your house, or if your home has storm damage, or if there's a crack in the foundation, wouldn't you then spend that money on those repairs before paying down the mortgage?
I think that you would if, in fact, you had the leak in the house that you're talking about. But what needs to always be remembered in this larger debate is that last year in South Carolina government we spent $19 billion. This year we will spend $21 billion. That's an 11% increase. It doesn't fit with the leak in the house that people are getting at. But people think that
the unemployment rate is the leak in the house and the crack in the foundation, because if people don't have jobs, they can't stay in their homes, they can't buy cars, they can't take care of their families. So
but the presumption there would be that only through spending a bunch more money that we don't have will we cure the employment question. And so, you know, all I'm saying is I think that we ought to hold to the same standard, that if people out there in the real world and the private sector who pay for government are having to make adjustments to their budget, why shouldn't we do the same in government? And I think that at the end of the day, what the debate is really about is about, are we going to reform some things or are we not? We've gotten this big windfall of federal money. We're talking about spending 90% of it. That's absolutely certain. The question is about the last 10%. And what we're saying is, should we set some money aside for a rainy day? And what others are saying, no, we need to spend every dime of it. But if we do, we will not make reforms that I think are essential to making South Carolina more competitive in offering jobs and employment.
Let me share with you an email that I received earlier today. It's from Lisa in West Columbia. She sent an email saying, Governor Sanford, thank you for taking a stand against this stimulus plan. Please don't give in. Our children and grandchildren will pay for it if we allow the federal government to keep this up. There are a lot of people who agree with Lisa and who agree with you in principle, but even Senator Lindsey Graham said that we can refuse to accept it, but we can't refuse to pay it back. So since it is the case that the next generation and even this generation is going to pay for this regardless of whether any money comes to South Carolina, how does that logic hold up?
But wouldn't that make that much more the case for paying down debt? In other words, because there's not a giant piggy bank in Washington, D.C. that we're about to raise. What we're talking about is going out and issuing more debt to come up with the money for the stimulus package, which means Marshall, Landon, Bolton, and Blake, and your kids and your grandkids are going to be paying for this thing.
Whether any money comes to South Carolina or not.
Which is why I say absolutely let's take the money, but let's take a portion of it to pay down debt so that those kids who are paying the bill will get some of the benefit for the current government expenditures that are going to be paid for with the stimulus bill. Because if not, if you just spend it all, then all you do is you leave to the kids the tab for the government expenditure that takes place now. And what we're saying is our grandmother's notion of a little bit of balance in everything. We're saying 90% of the money is going to get spent. Can't we set aside 10% for paying down debt that will then impact the very kids that are going to be paying for this thing?
Well, let's talk about that notion of debt versus creating jobs. And in just a moment, we're going to check back in with Ben with some viewer email questions with our online chat. But first, in terms of paying debt versus creating jobs, today the State Department of Education released results of a new survey, a statewide survey including responses from 2/3 of the state's 86 school districts. It estimates that without the stimulus money, 5,700 education jobs are going to be cut, and about half of those would be teachers. But with the stimulus money, they estimate that 1,600 jobs would be cut. So the question a lot of people have is, why is paying down debt so important right now, or more important really, than trying to save those jobs, especially when we are the state with the second highest unemployment rate?
The key, though, is how they got to that conclusion. And the way they got to that conclusion was not looking at the House budget. It was not looking at our budget, both of which came within $3 of each other on the base student cost without, in our case, without any stimulus dollars, and on the case of the House budget with a moderate piece of the stimulus dollars. What leads to those numbers is the so-called chaos budget that was created by Senator Leatherman.
Hear me out. Go ahead and finish up.
Was created by Senator Leatherman and the Senate Finance Committee. And what they did was leave out over $550 million that is absolutely coming here to South Carolina. So absolutely insincere to say, look, Sanford, if you don't take this $700 million, half of which it would be in this year, $350 million this year, we're going to have chaos. But, oh, by the way, I'm going to leave off $550 million of federal money that is absolutely certainly coming here to South Carolina.
I totally get your point with that. But what I read based on this survey, it's not based on that budget that Senator Leatherman's committee put out. It was based on a survey of the school districts, based on where their budget is right now, talking with those superintendents. If you don't get another dime, this is what you're going to have to lay off. If you get money that you know is available through the stimulus, then this would be your situation.
I hear where you're coming from.
So they're asking the question again,
right.
why pay down debt instead of trying to save those jobs?
The answer is because even without paying down any debt, right, not including that money, we will go from spending $3.3 billion this year at the state level to $3.5 billion this coming year at the state level in education. That's a 4% increase. Now, how does we survived this budget year. It wasn't a perfect budget year at the school district level, but did you see hundreds of teachers being laid off this year?
But we've already heard about some teachers being laid off in different districts already right now.
Did you see hundreds being laid off, though?
No.
And we spent $3.3 billion. Next year, we're going to spend 4% more. We're going to spend $3.5 billion. It just doesn't fit with the numbers that we see out there.
I guess the whole point, Governor, is that there already are some districts in Lexington County and Florence County who've already made teacher layoffs. They've already cut some positions.
Sure.
And they feel as though if they got this money, and I think everybody knows this money, this $700 million, isn't going to solve all the education problems in South Carolina, but they feel like it could save some jobs. And so why not save the jobs you can?
I understood. The catch is, if you spend all the stimulus money, you end up $740 million in the hole 24 months from now. And my question to you is, okay, now what are we going to do about the teacher jobs then? And the easiest thing of all for me would be just to kick the can down the road, figure I'm out of here in 18 months. I'm heading back to the coast of South Carolina in 18. I'm done. Somebody else can worry about it in 24 months. But that wouldn't be acting as a fiduciary if I did that. So I think that the bigger question is, because if you do this, if you spend it all, you end up with an absolute annualization hole of $740 million, which I would argue is a real big problem 24 months from now.
All right, let's check in with Ben and get one of our viewer questions. Ben?
Well, Governor and Judy, we have received a ton of questions. Viewers are very dialed into this issue. This is a list. This is actually a pile of the questions that we've received so far. And this question is from A. Curry from Florence. My husband is a teacher. His contract was not renewed due to budget cuts. What are your plans for the teachers that have already lost their jobs due to budget cuts and for other unemployed citizens with no job prospects? Governor, that's a question for you.
I would say we are continuing to look both around the country and around the globe at ways to attract capital and investment to our state, such that you're helping people in the public sector and the private sector of South Carolina. I had a visit this very week with a Korean firm looking at the I-85 corridor in Greenville at producing a neat product, and I hope they come here. We're pushing them as hard as we can. You may have read the news about the company coming to Barnwell that will eventually lead to 1,000 employees in a place that desperately needs jobs in South Carolina. So I'd say we're continuing to do that and in essence tell the South Carolina story, combined with trying to make sure that our financial ship of state is in good order so that if this financial storm lasts more than 24 months, we've got latitude. We're fourth in the United States of America in what we allocate to paying down debt. In other words, think about that. 11% of what we spend at state level goes not to teachers, not to health care, but to bondholders in New York or Zurich. And what we're saying is, shouldn't we take some of that? You know, the immediate savings just over the first 2 years is $166 million that would not go to interest, that could go to education, and I think that it would pay substantial dividends, particularly if this financial storm goes beyond the 24-month period, because then you got financial latitude to increase debt, to spend more, to do a lot of things that you don't have if you've got a very tight balance sheet, which is where ours is right now.
Let me ask you this. Some of this money would also be targeted toward public safety. Let's take a listen to what SLED Director Reggie Lloyd had to say about the potential budget cuts.
This is as bad as it gets, folks. We're talking about almost 3,000 or over 3,000 prisoners being put back on the street early.
Obviously, people are very concerned when they hear that type of prediction about public safety in South Carolina.
Again, that comment's based on the chaos budget. You didn't see that him saying that after the House finished its budget. You didn't see him saying that after we finished our budget. Again, the larger debate is almost the same equivalent of what went on with GM. You know, General Motors was told, look, just give us all these billions of dollars, we'll make reform, and then we'll be better off. They took the billions, but they didn't make the reform. At the South Carolina, and now the President of the United States has gone in, replaced the chairman and the number 2 guy, saying we'll make the reform. What we've got to look at, and we have $270 million worth of these in our budget, are some serious reforms. But that means you're protecting things like law enforcement, you're protecting things like education.
Let me ask you this, because we're running short on time. When you look at issues like public safety and you hear the director, Reggie Lloyd, making that type of prediction, can you then guarantee the people of South Carolina that prisons won't be shut down and that prisoners won't be released early because of the budget cuts?
What I can guarantee is the budget that we produced absolutely did not do that. And what I've seen thus far of the House budget is that it did not do that either. What was talked about in the chaos budget absolutely did that by withholding $550 million worth of federal money that is going to get spent.
Ben, another question from a viewer?
Judy, we have Alan from Leesville asking, when all the polls indicate South Carolina citizens greatly wish you to accept the funding, how can you continue to listen to a, quote, silent majority? We've had a number of viewers asking about this silent majority that you, Governor, have been talking about. Who exactly is this majority?
They are the guy working at Nucor Steel who's just busy getting himself to and from work. It's the soccer mom getting the kids to and from school and to soccer practice. It's a lot of people across our state who are not particularly engaged in politics, but who have, I think, legitimate and genuine concerns about how much common sense it makes to spend what accounts to the mother of all lotteries for our state budget. We're talking about as much money as we spend on an annual basis suddenly coming into South Carolina in 1 year. And what I think a number of people have said quite reasonably is, okay, if we spend the overwhelming bulk of this to try and help revive the economy based on what the president wants to do, though we may agree or may disagree with that philosophically, what if we also carved off a piece of it to pay down debt so that we had a stronger financial position in the event that this financial storm lasts more than 24 months? I think that's the silent majority that I'm listening to, and I think that they make a lot of sense on this.
Let me ask you this, because some people have criticized saying they believe that you are out of touch and that you have never had to deal with the...
You're not making me cry.
But, no, I know, it's the allergies. I'm not making the governor cry. But they've criticized saying that you're out of touch and that you've never had the hardship of being laid off or of living to paycheck to paycheck. We know that you were at Furman University to speak recently, talking with students. But have you spent any time talking to some of the people who are collecting unemployment checks, who are getting through these difficult times, who've been looking for months to find a job and they just haven't been able to get back on their feet?
I had one of the neatest exchanges this morning. A gentleman who's a security guard over at ETV, and I was leaving there bright and early this morning, and he came over to me. He's an older gentleman, a black gentleman, neat guy. I'd never talked to him before. I'd seen him a number of times. But he came over to me and he grabbed me by the arm and he said, do what you think is best.
But he has a job, right?
What's that?
But he has a job, right?
Yeah, but it's not...
But I'm saying, have you talked to any of the people who don't have the job?
I've talked to all kinds of different people in South Carolina, but I'm just telling you, here was a man of simple means who looked at all the fanfare that's been going on this week and said, do what you think is best. And
I guess my point is, Governor, even with us, we've reported on layoffs so many times, but in my own family, I know people who have been laid off. At this station, there have been people laid off, and we saw it from a different perspective once it hit home, so to speak. And so the people of South Carolina want to know if you can connect and relate to that, and if you've talked to people who are going through that experience right now.
But let me say this. That is the equivalent of saying, because Obama, the President of the United States, has never been laid off, he can't empathize with people who might be laid off. In other words, I would respectfully disagree with the hypothesis. Whether you've been laid off or whether you haven't been laid off is irrelevant to the larger...
But if you talk to those people to understand their experience, not necessarily whether you've been laid off.
Yeah, the answer is yes.
Okay.
And so I hear from a wide swath of different South Carolinians, you ought to come to me with office hours. I mean, we have people that have been laid off, people that are employed, people who are not employed, people who are on parole, people who are looking for a pardon. You name the life circumstance, and I've talked to them. And I'm saying the sum total of those different conversations leads me to the position that we're at.
Let's go back to Ben and get one more question in from our viewers. Ben?
Well, Judy, as you know, we received a lot of questions from viewers over the phone and on the internet wondering Governor, you are not the only governor turning down a portion of the stimulus money. Sarah Palin, Rick Perry, Bobby Jindal, all doing the same. And those names and yours are being tossed around to run for the Republican nomination in 4 years. Is this purely coincidental, or is this politicians jockeying for the nomination?
I'd say a couple different things. You left off the name Phil Bredesen, who's the Democratic governor of Tennessee, who's not running for president and is declining part of the stimulus money, at least what I've heard thus far, with regard to unemployment insurance. So I'd say you got to include the whole group of who all's looking at this. I'd also say this. You've observed me for a number of years now. It's almost as if I was doing something different, then I'd really be acting out of character. But the bottom line is, I get it right, I get it wrong from time to time, but I have consistently tried to act from the standpoint of pushing towards sustainable spending. And what we're really pushing for at the end of the day is, how do we keep our spending sustainable in South Carolina, and how do we shore up our finances just a little bit so that if these tough times continue to roll for a while, we're in a good shape to offer benefits and to provide employment opportunities to the people of the state.
Governor, you've been very gracious with your time. Let's just wrap up by asking, is there any chance that you will change your mind and before that deadline tomorrow night at midnight decide to accept this money and spend it toward education, Department of Public Safety,
what we've consistently said is we absolutely, again, we're talking about 90% of the money is going to come to the state.
Right.
We're talking about the last 10%. I would say at some point you begin to negotiate against yourself if you've gotten down to the 90-10 portion of a stimulus package you originally disagreed with. And what we have said is it is truly in the budget writers' hands on the Senate side and the House side. And if they say they're willing to put it to debt, we'll sign that paperwork tomorrow.
But if they don't, you will not?
Correct.
All right. Governor Mark Sanford, we again thank you for making WIS your first stop for your live interview to talk about the stimulus standoff. We want to make sure that our viewers understand what's at stake, they understand your decision, and can make an informed decision about where they feel how the money should be spent. Thank you very much, Governor. We appreciate it.
Yes, ma'am.
Ben, back over to you.
Okay, Governor, thank you very much. The news at 6.